Well, here I am drinking coffee and bringing entry 11 into my father's tales this April 2020 as we remain in COVID-19 lockdown. Challenging time for us. But back in 1949, uh, there was a great flood in Fort Worth, Texas, where my parents lived. Again, I did not exist at that time, but I heard stories and I know about it for sure. It was devastating. The banks of the Trinity River, Fort Worth, Texas, was built on the banks of the Trinity River, and there were days and days and days of pounding rain, and this massive flood was a result of that from the rising Trinity River and I guess the banks of it. Any dam system they had broke, but it it impacted 1,000 businesses and I think 13,000 people or something like that. 10,000 anyway were left homeless, and where my parents lived was on a hill, and so they were okay. But why I bring it up is because I've talked a lot about my dad and boating. And this was one time when he used his boat for very serious work because residents in Fort Worth, in order to get around, really, if you wanted to get around very much, you had to use a boat to get here and there. But so much of the city was underwater. But what he did, he got in his one of his boats and he went over to this part of town that wasn't really that far from where we lived, but far enough. And because we were on a hill, the water did not reach the house. But he got in his boat and went over to this area of Fort Worth, 7th Street, and there still is a building there. It was the old Montgomery Ward's catalog and retail store in Fort Worth, and I think now it is a I think it's apartments or condominiums or something there in Fort Worth, I believe. But it was a huge building, and that was the part of town where he took his rescue work. He worked with the rescue people there. He didn't head up anything, but he was part of the rescue operation where he would go around and rescue people that were stranded or stuck or needed help, and he did that for days with his boat. So I wanted to bring that in and mention the great flood of Fort Worth, Texas, and the role that my father played in it. If you get a chance, look at some aerial photos of the Great Flood. Just Google it because it's unbelievable. But you will see the Montgomery Ward building cassettes that played a major role in the flood rescue or something, because that was the area that my father worked in, was around the part of town where Montgomery Ward's the catalog and retail store was. It was a store that my parents shopped at, that store as well. But moving from that to my father always teaching and helping people, and he both he and my sister gave me driving lessons when I was about 15. They thought I needed to learn how to drive. It was time, and it almost ruined me for life for driving because they both had uh, standard shift cars. They had stick shifts, and I didn't have the patience for that, or the skill set, or the. I felt like it was unnecessary because why not get an automatic? But according to Daddy, if you learn on a stick shift car, you can always drive. And I could get in a stick shift now. It wouldn't be pretty, and I would limp along. But I know the H system. I know first up, second down, third, and then up and over reverse. I know this. I know how it works. And Gerry has had two MGBs, of which I have also driven, and not in a good way. I'm no good at it. I'm absolutely no good at it. My first car was automatic, and I've had automatic ever since. Why wouldn't you? The When you're on the slant, when you're on a hill, and you have to maneuver the brake and the clutch and shift and all of that, and you slide backwards, that's enough to ruin it for you right there. But he was a good teacher, and they both were, and he I was an impatient. I want to learn something right away, and so I didn't have any patience, and I even though my father uh, taught me, the one thing that stuck with me, um, I still hear his voice in my head. Not that I heed it all that well, is to not let drivers around you bother you. Pay attention to traffic as needed, but not unnecessarily. Don't let people that are on your bumper or cut in front of you uh, bother you. And that still sticks with me. Like I said, although I'm not necessarily that great about it. My father could do these fun things, though. He could, when Gerry and I were dating, he brought over a fish bowl with 2 goldfish in it, and he was romantic. Like he still is. He still does stuff like that. He's sweet. He's a wonderfully sweet, kind man, and very romantic and giving. And so when he brought me these fish, and after a few days, as will happen with goldfish, they died. And I came home. I'd been gone. I came home. They were dead, and I started crying because, you know how young love is. Oh my gosh, the fish Gerry gave me died. My parents left, and a little bit later they came back with goldfish. Of course, it wasn't the same as getting goldfish from this wonderful guy in my life, but it was very sweet. And so I don't know how long those two lasted. Goldfish, they don't last a lot. As I've mentioned before, my dad was of average height, but he played basketball in high school, and people have told me that he was really good. People down where he lived, and we would go visit, what a wonderful basketball player my dad was, and said he was really fast and could maneuver on the court and make the baskets. And even when he would come to our house, and we had a standard basketball goal installed, Gerry did, for kids to play with Brandon, and Gerry played. Daddy would always grab a basketball, and he always put it through the hoop. He always made the shot. So while he was a really smart man, he also had these other skills. One weird thing to me was that when he came to Fort Worth, he as a very young, he was still in his teens, to continue learning his skill, his work skill. He uh, was encouraged by the man that was sponsoring him to come to Fort Worth to learn, the one that was kind of responsible for him. It's like, you have these skills, I want you to learn this. And so he was with Daddy a lot, and so he encouraged him to be in Golden Gloves, give him something to do way back in those days, and he did, and lightweight or whatever he would have been because he was thin, and he did box, but he never watched boxing. He always loved to watch basketball, mainly football, but he never really watched boxing that I ever recall. But I guess he still had those boxer moves. And when I see, they said Matt Damon, when he was training for the one of his films, uh, they told him to walk like a boxer, and because he didn't really have that kind of stance, and so I, in seeing that movie, I would think about my dad, because my dad kind of had that same stride when he walked, and it made me think about that. But one thing that was a disappointment to my dad that he would talk about in Woe was when he went to the state spelling bee. I was always good at spelling, I still am, but he uh, I make typos when I type, because everything I type is with my little finger on the tiny keyboard on the phone, and then I hit send. It's like, oh, should have read that. But he went to the state spelling bee, and back in the day, I'm sure the spelling bee was not what it became. Newspapers, when I worked some with spelling bee situation at the newspaper, because the newspapers have always been very big in sponsoring spelling bees across the country. And I'm sure back in his day they were, even on a state level, very modest, but he went to the state spelling bee, and he always lamented over the word that he missed, because he couldn't believe it. He said when they gave him the word to spell, he went completely blank. Nothing came to his head, and he misspelled the word, and it was all together. He said, how can you miss all to get her? How can you miss that word? And he talked about that forever. So this is my entry 11 into my father's tales, and I have some more that I will be bringing, a couple that are really important to me. One is his well-known and beloved barbecue. He barbecued like a pro. So I'm gonna share that. I want to get that on tape. And uh, I have a few other things on my list to talk about. It's narrowing about one that was a very big deal in my young years with him. Uh, Musicality in our home, and I don't mean records. I've already talked about that. I'm talking about real instrumentation in jam sessions. So I'm going to talk about that. And I hope if anyone is out there listening and sharing, I appreciate it, of my father's tales.